concept of biological race or socially constructed race in humans is America's own original science fiction. What you're looking at here is a portion of the table from the back of the book, The Indigenous Races of Mankind, published in 1857 by Josiah Nott and George R. Glidden. And they typify the thinking of 19th century naturalists, Joey, on race. They thought that races were hierarchically ranked, discrete entities created in their positions on the scale of nature, with Europeans placed at the pinnacle.
Commissioner, that our minds will not be twisted, not by Lokai, nor by you. It is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed. The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself. Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me. Look at me. You're black on one side and white on the other. I am black on the right side. I fail to see the significant difference. Lokai is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side.
Many of you recognize this episode. It is called, you've watched it enough time. This is from the episode Let This Be Their Last Battlefield, in which Bailey, the alien police commissioner, pursues his adversary Lokai to the bridge of the Enterprise. And in this exchange, Bailey explains to Spock and Kirk why Lokai is a criminal and why he is of a, quote, inferior breed. Spock points out that by visual evidence... Yes, son? What's the question?
What are you doing?
I'm talking about race. Now, will you let me finish? Okay, thanks. And so, Bailey explains the significance of the racial differences between them. He says that Lokai's people are white on the right side, and that his people are black on the right side. Now, you might think that Roddenberry just made this up to make a point. I don't know if Gene Roddenberry wrote this script or not, but yeah. They did this just to make the point, but in fact, what they were explaining is that the insignificant difference, which clearly appeared to Earthlings as an insignificant difference, whether you're black on the right or the left side of the face, is the same sort of insignificant physical difference which we use to construct our racial on planet Earth. I'm going to demonstrate that in the next 30 minutes. Now, it's also important to know that human beings didn't always think in racial categories. That they didn't always think in hierarchical differences between physical populations, populations of different physical attributes. So, although the ancients noticed physical differences between individuals and populations, we don't find universal hierarchies of race. Contrary to the popular belief, the Bible doesn't contain any stated racism against Africans. For example, Exodus 12:2 to 12:15 states that Moses' wife Zipporah was an Ethiopian. Now, as most of the people here know, the Bible has been translated through the Greek into other languages. In the Greek, the word aeops means anyone of African physical features. So we don't know that Zipporah came from the region that is Ethiopia today. There's a good chance that she did. But what is clear is in this passage, she is not Semitic. And it's very clear that she's someone from sub-Saharan Africa. And in this passage, Moses' brother's wife, Miriam, is punished for her racist attitudes towards Zipporah. So again, and this appears throughout the Bible, there are no inherent belief in the inferiority of Africans. Now, the Greek physician Hippocrates felt physical differences resulted from climate. Aristotle's Scala Naturae was not inherently racist either. It distinguished humbler folks from noble folk. The Roman scholar Vitruvius, who wrote between 46 to 30 BC, found that the warm climate was associated with intelligence. Thus he attributed the sluggish intellect of the Britons, French, and Germans to their cold climate. Now, the fact that these nations were in opposition to the Roman Empire might have had something to do with Vitruvius' ideas of who was inferior and who was superior. Now, we see the origin of the modern racial hierarchies with the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And this brings together, for the first time, Africans, Amerindians, and Europeans in extensive social contact. Not only are these groups brought together, but they're brought together in a particular way, related to a specific social hierarchy, and that is with Europeans on top, Amerindians sort of in an intermediate position, and African slaves the lowest of the social hierarchy. In addition, these populations are brought together without the intermediate populations that occur between them in the diversity of human genetic variability. So, for example, if you look at the writings of Marco Polo walked from Central Europe to Eastern Asia.
China.
Yes, sure, to China. And in Marco Polo's writings, we don't see any discussion of race. And that's in part because he walks and sees the continual gradient of change between populations in Europe and populations in Asia. So he doesn't talk about race in discrete categories. So these conditions are the first time that we start seeing naturalists beginning to talk about race as if it's a discrete category. Xavier.
Is Marco Polo the game when you say Marco or
The game Marco Polo is derived from the explorer, Marco Polo. Now, here we go. This is a table that shows the views of 18th century naturalists on the racial traits of the Negro. And I'm going to walk over here so I can point to the screen. And what's clear is that in the 18th century, there's no general belief that Negroes or Africans are inferior to Europeans. For example, Francois Bernier says, neutral. Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, one of the co-inventors of the calculus, is neutral. Most importantly, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, known as the founder of modern anthropology, says there's no objective ranking of human races, as did many of his students. In addition to that, most importantly, none of these writers consider Africans or anyone else to be members of a separate species. They all clearly see that while there are varieties in the human species, none of these varieties are distinct enough to be considered separate. Now this changes in the 19th century. Okay? By the 19th century, naturalists have declared the general inferiority of non-European races. Cuvier, described as the Aristotle of his age, saw the Negro as the most degraded of human races. Now most of you probably do not know that the debate of the Paris Academy of Sciences in 1839 between Georges Cuvier and, I keep forgetting this guy, he's one of the first evolutionary biologists in Europe, whose name now escapes me. Anyway, the subject of that debate is whether the human species is unitary, whether body plans give evidence of descent with modification, as Cuvier's opponent argued, or whether they are discrete plans on the scale of nature, as Cuvier argued. And the main body of evidence in this argument was the human races. Cuvier arguing that because these lower varieties of humankind are so different and so unlike Europeans, it must be clear that they were the acts of special creation along the scale of nature.
Sir?
Yes.
When did we, if I forget, when did we first start forcing African Americans to come over to this country as slaves? When did that start?
The first African Americans who were imported to the English colonies was 1619, 3 years before the Plymouth landed in New England, in Jamestown. It's interesting to note, while we're on that point, if you read the official history of Virginia, they sort of don't mention that. And you think, again, I looked at the Microsoft Encarta in 1999 version. The article on Virginia doesn't mention the first importation of African slaves to the English colonies. It mentions everything else, but doesn't mention that. It's sort of a small historical event. Hey, why put it in history books? Now, 19th century naturalists now completely changed their views. Charles White comes up with the idea that Africans are inferior. Stanhope Smith Pritchard, Sir William Lawrence, George's Cuvier, what we talked about. Samuel Morton, Louis Agassiz, Jonathan Bachman, Josiah Nott, George R. Glidden, and Paul Broca. Now, of these, the only one who felt that the traits of Africans were equal to Europeans is the southern slaveholder John Bachman. And he does this on the basis of the biological species criteria, which is the fertility of the hybrids, what he called hybrids. And he saw that there was no apparent loss of viability in the offspring of master-slave relations compared to slave-slave or master-master. And so he realizes that, well, these populations are really the same, and in fact members of the same species. But note, Lawrence, Cuvier, Morton, Agassiz, Nott, Glidden, and Paul Broca all saying that Negroes are members of a separate species. And why are these people important? Well, they became the American School of Craniometry. They attempted to produce objective measures of the inferiority of non-European races by measuring their skull sizes. Now, this is a story that's been well told in Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today. However, I call Agassiz, Morton, Nott, and Glidden the four horsemen of craniometry. Now, why do they get this distinction? Louis Agassiz was the main theorist of polygeny, or the idea that there were separate human species. He was the founder of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Samuel Morton, probably the most popular and well-regarded American scientist of the era, president of the American Academy of Sciences. Nott and Glidden are lay people, but they are the main popularizers of the polygenist idea. And they are extremely important. So you go from the theorists to the experimentalists to the popularizers. Nott and Glidden were renowned for their lectures on Negrology through the American South. And they were considered the experts. They were the people who would be here. If you were Southern slaveholders, you would be having meetings on Sunday with George R. Nott or Josiah Glidden here telling you about how your slaves were separate species and how you were doing them a favor and raising their status by employing them for gainful labor. Okay, so these guys are very important. As I said, they wrote the book, Indigenous Races of Mankind, 1857. Now, does this have an impact on society? Well, of course it does. And again, the reason why we need to look at the impact of scientific theories and what it does in society. Frederick Douglass, spelled with two S's, not one, realized the significance of Nott and Glidden's tactics. If, for instance, a phrenologist or a naturalist undertakes to represent portraits, he will invariably present the highest form of European and the lowest form of Negro. In his lecture to Case Reserve in 1854. Now here's an example of that. This is a plate from Indigenous Races of Mankind. So we have a young chimpanzee, a Negro, and this person is the bust of Apollo Belvedere. So it's not just any European, not just the guy off the street. Now again, this chimpanzee is also a young chimpanzee. Now this is important if you understand evolutionary biology, because in species that are closely related, and humans are closely related to chimps, the physical similarities are greatest in the juvenile stages. So if you take an older chimpanzee, the similarities which they attempt to show in this figure wouldn't be as apparent. But they chose a young chimpanzee. Now they didn't know that, but I think they were conscientious in how they chose the figures and reproduced them to make their point.
Where is the skull of Apollo Belvedere statue?
So now, we can ask ourselves, again, does this influence society? Well, Chief Justice Roger Taney, his views in the Dred Scott decision were clearly influenced by the prevailing scientific beliefs of the time. Okay, and he writes that Negroes were not human in his famous Supreme Court decision on March 7, 1857. Point which I think is one of the darkest days in the history of the American Supreme Court. And if you don't know the language, I'll repeat it. Justice Taney says that Dred Scott, the Negro, has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And if you don't know the story of Dred Scott, you should, because American history turns on this decision. Okay, this is one of the precursor decisions to the Civil War. Dred Scott was enslaved in Kentucky. His master moved to a free state, Wisconsin, and Dred Scott became a free man. In Wisconsin, he married, had children, had his own farm. The former master decides to move back to Kentucky, and then he goes to Dred Scott and says, well, you're my property, you have to come with me. And he then sues in Wisconsin court for his freedom, saying that I'm in a free state, I have no obligation to go back to Kentucky. The local court upholds Dred Scott's rights to stay in Wisconsin. And then the circuit court overturns it. And finally it's heard in the Supreme Court. And that's where Taney, using the scientific data and thinking of his day, reduces Dred Scott to being the same, and again, the decision reads as chattel, furniture, oxen, ducks, and things of so forth.
Or women.
Okay? Say again?
And women.
No. Women,
Chattel.
well, in this time, the term chattel doesn't refer to women in the same way it did to slaves.
Well,
Okay, I said that there were significant differences. There are significant differences in the way African slaves were being treated and Euro-American women in this time period. In fact, one of the reasons, one of the things that very few people know is that the feminist movement gets its start in the abolitionist movement. All the people that you read about as being the forerunners of feminism, like Susan B. Anthony, were first abolitionists. Okay, and then began to fight for women's rights in conjunction to ending slavery. Subsidiary point. Now, Lincoln addressed this in his debates with Stephen O. Douglas. If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. So Lincoln clearly understands that the issue of slavery hinges on whether African Americans or Negroes are human or not. Now, everything changes with the publication of The Origin of Species. Now, before The Origin, naturalists ranked all organisms, including human races, on the scale of nature. Okay, and you guys probably know where the scale of nature originates, so let's just talk about The Origin. Okay. In 1859, changes our understanding of biological variation within and between species. This did not help but have profound implications on the interpretation of human diversity. Now, I'm going to give you another aside here, because some of you do not know that I just got back from Louisiana, where I testified in front of the House Subcommittee on Education on an anti-Darwin resolution which was written by an African-American legislator, in which he claims that Charles Darwin was the originator of modern scientific racism. Now, in my, well, what she really was doing was advancing a creationist agenda under the guise of progressive social requirements or needs. Anyway, this all comes from this period, and I'm going to point out that that thinking is thoroughly wrong in the next couple slides. Sir Charles Lyell, then president of the Royal Academy of Sciences in the UK, immediately recognized that The Origin of Species poses the question of human ancestry. Lyell posed the question, go back umpteen generations and would blacks and whites find a common ancestry? Itself the descendant of an ape. The very idea would give shock to nearly all men. No university would sanction it, even teaching it would ensure the expulsion of a professor already installed. Certainly in the state of Louisiana. And we've had to fight this very battle in Arizona 2 years ago.
Well, sir,
Yes.
then I have just a real quick question.
Mhm.
If I'm reading that right, and I might be reading it wrong, where do these people think the races came from? Did God create them separately or something? Or?
What, the polygenists?
Yes.
Yeah, they thought that there were separate creations on the scale of nature that were separate species.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were separate species, and there's a whole discussion of the pre-Adamite races. Because if you read Genesis, it's open to all sorts of interpretations. Because you've got Adam and Eve, you've got Cain and Abel. Abel is slain by Cain, and Cain has to reproduce with someone, right? So Cain goes off and he knows his wife, and his wife comes from the land of Nod. And so some people interpret that there were separate creations. and that there were other races of human beings who were created before Adam and Eve. Otherwise, where's Cain's wife comes from, right? So there was a whole discussion in the 1600s of the pre-Adamite races, which I, again, discuss in my book. Now, Darwin felt that the American polygenist Agassiz would be incensed. Agassiz will throw a boulder at me, and many others will come. However, Darwin doubted whether human races were real or are real. He described the racial multiplication problem, and he called human races protean or polymorphic in The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871. Now, I'm briefly going to describe what I mean by the racial multiplication problem. Darwin looks at the writings of naturalists on human varieties and recognizes that between 2 and 63 races have been identified. Now, there are similar problems of this in systematics, which Darwin, because of his background, recognized again that whenever you have that many naturalists disagreeing on how many varieties there are, that's an indication that the criteria they're using are of dubious value, that those criteria are not related to the fundamental biology of the organism. So Darwin points out that if these differences were so important, then natural selection would have eliminated those a long time ago. And so when they're not that important, they become protean or polymorphic. And so therefore, he says you can draw any number of races you like. And if you can draw any number of races you like, then the use of the term itself is suspect. Okay, now this is in The Descent of Man, published in 1871. Now, the reason why people mistakenly give Darwin credit for revitalizing modern scientific racism is because of the writings of people like John Jeffries, okay, who co-opts Darwinist ideas to reestablish racial hierarchy. In his book, The Natural History of the Human Races, published in 1869, Jeffries simply takes the African and makes him the primitive organism in the evolutionary lineage which leads to modern Europeans. And how do we know that they're primitive? Well, they're primitive because they have a sub-90 degree facial angle. And ours know that the facial angle is supposed to be 90 degrees. And so one can measure the inferiority of various human groups by their deviation from the course, pre-chosen 90 degree facial angle. Now, John Jeffries isn't the only person who does this. The German biologist Ernst Haeckel, who was a convinced Aryanist, and who comes up with a theory of evolution very different from Charles Darwin's, takes this whole idea, and again, using his theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, places the other so-called races of humankind as the ontological stages on the road or on the path to the evolution of the Aryan race. And Haeckel was a favorite of the German race hygiene movement. Haeckel is invoked by Rosenfeld and the Nazi race theorists. Okay? And so if you didn't know the history, one could come to the conclusion that Darwin was responsible for this, but in fact he's not. Now, the implications for Darwinism and the biological race concept really don't become clarified until well after the 1960s, which again, feeds into this whole hysteria about scientific racism and Darwinian ideas. The neo-Darwinian synthesis occurs between 1900 and 1940, and what this represents is the unification of Mendelian genetics with Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. When Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, he didn't have a workable genetic theory that explained how variations were inherited and how natural selection acted on those variations. Mendel's genetics provided that. And the unification of these represents probably, in my mind, one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the 20th century by some of the greatest minds of the 20th century. People like Sir Ronald A. Fisher, for example. Anyone who knows statistics knows that Fisher was the one who came up with the analysis of variance. But what you probably don't know is why did Fisher come up with this test? Okay? Fisher came up with the analysis of variance because he was interested in the inheritance within families versus shared traits between families, which is a quantitative genetic and evolutionary problem. And he invented the statistical techniques to solve that problem. Other people, Sewell Wright, who invents path analysis, J.B.S. Haldane, T.H. Dobzhansky, okay? And Dobzhansky happens to be an intellectual progenitor of mine through a couple of leaps, okay? These people created a whole rich body of mathematical theory, which becomes evolutionary genetics. But one of its offspring was the classical eugenics movement, okay, which again misappropriates Darwinian ideas for the services of those who wish to create an elitist society. Now, in my book, in chapters 8, I discuss the origin of the classical eugenics movement, its goals, and how it worked. But again, it's not the topic of today's lecture. Now, by the 1960s, the implications of evolutionary theory for human variation are still unclear. For example, this plate appears in a book over here called Our Face from Fish to Man. And these are human ancestors, different species along the supposed phylogenetic trees of humans. Now, you'll note that we have different species up until we get to humans. And so we place two representatives of the human species on different branches. All the rest of these are members of different species, but when we get to humans, we can't put the humans on the same branch. Okay, now of course, who can tell me what region of the world this gentleman is likely to be from? Any guesses?
Does it rhyme with Africa?
All right, do you think that this guy could be a sub-Saharan African?
Yeah.
But it turns out that he's not.
Australia.
Yeah, he's a Tasmanian.
Yeah.
And I'm going to revisit this point in a few slides. This person is a Tasmanian. Okay, now this person here is a Roman athlete. Okay, not just anybody, but a Roman athlete. So here we go back to the highest and the lowest, the alpha and the omega of humankind.
They didn't pick Jesse Owens.
Yeah. All right, now, having discussed the confusions of racial thinking, now what I'd like to do is talk about how modern evolutionary geneticists define races and explain why there are no races in the anatomically modern humans. Now, there are two criteria. There must be sufficient amounts of genetic distance consistent with what we call subspecies, or populations must have been maintained as unique evolutionary lineages. Now, we've measured the genetic variability in things that naturalists have called subspecies in the past. Those things have about, on average, 20% genetic distance within them. Now, before I go on talking about genetic distances, I want to be clear to everyone in the audience that we're talking about the genes that exist within a species, not genes that exist between species. So people will hear that the chimp and human have about 3% genetic distance between them. Those are genes between species. So when we talk about 20% genetic distance, we're talking about of the genes that are within the human species, 20% difference between them. So we're only talking about genes within anatomically modern humans. Okay? So you need to find about 20% genetic distance within the species. Now, do we find that in anatomically modern humans? See in the next slide. Or have populations been maintained as unique evolutionary lineages? Now, this model explains the current thinking of how anatomically modern humans came about. Populations in Africa, populations in Europe, populations in Asia. We suspect that through all times of human history, that there was sufficient gene flow between all of these populations such that they could never be considered unique lineages. And you've probably seen books showing either what's called the multi-regional model, in which you have evolution here from Homo erectus to anatomically modern humans, evolution here, and evolution here, or the out of Africa hypothesis, in which you see those evolutionary lineages and then a second group that comes out and overtakes those. We now suspect that both of those models are wrong. That in fact what we've always had is a situation in which there's been populations with significant gene flow back and forth through the evolution of Homo erectus in Africa to anatomically modern humans. Next. Oh, I'm sorry.
Nobody.
Now, if we look at the amount of genetic overlap in anatomically modern humans, they've always had considerable genetic overlap, and you can read about this in Cavalli, Schwarza, and Manuzzi and Piazza's book called The Geography of Human Genes. Now, they've also maintained relatively high levels of gene flow throughout history. And this is a way to show that. This graph shows a statistic that we call FST, which was derived by Sewell Wright. What it is a statistic that tells you the genetic distance within populations versus genetic distance between them. Okay? And we're comparing anatomically large-bodied animals that have good dispersal capacity. It would make sense to you, for example, that if I took trees that couldn't move around much, that I would find a great deal of population subdivision in trees. Okay? That makes sense. But if I take things that can move around a great deal, then you wouldn't necessarily find populations that are genetically different from each other. Because it would be sort of like taking a glass. Is this one empty? Yeah, it's got orange juice in it. Make the point. So, I want to equalize the concentration of these solutions. If I pour them back and forth, eventually concentrations are going to be equalized. Okay, so if they can move, we're going to equalize their gene frequencies. Now, so those are the only relevant things to compare. If I compare things that can't move, then of course, that's beating a dead horse. So let's compare things that can move. Well, this black bar represents anatomically modern humans. So that's us. That's compared to the African buffalo, the water buck from Kenya, and this is impala from Kenya, wildebeest, bighorn sheep from the southwestern United States, coyote, okay, elephants, white-tailed deer, Grant's gazelle, and these are all wolf populations. Now, the FST statistic can go from 0, meaning no population subdivision whatsoever, to 1, meaning totally subdivided. Well, humans are about 0.14, which means we have very little population subdivision, compared to something like gray wolf from the northern hemisphere, which is at 0.85. Very subdivided. Now, again, anyone who knows anything about ecology can tell you why things like the gray wolf are going to have subdivided populations. And it's simple. We've broken up their habitat. Right? We're afraid of them being around their livestock, so we shoot them. So they're small populations, and they're not allowed to migrate freely. And so therefore, their gene frequencies are going to deviate in individual populations. Humans, however, have always moved around a great deal and have interbred freely. Therefore, humans have very little population subdivision. Now, okay. Now, you've also probably seen in textbooks diagrams like these, in which you can show specific lineages of modern humans. This one shows sub-Saharan Africans and two particularly distinct groups, Zaire and Pygmies, and Pygmies from the Central African Republic, as compared to Europeans, Chinese, and Melanesians. Now, the problem with these diagrams is these diagrams are not statistically significant. So, while people print these in their books, there's something that they need to show, which they don't show. It's called the cophonetic coefficient. And that justifies whether this tree is just simply something the computer draws, or is it something that's statistically significant from 0. So, for a cophonetic coefficient to be significant, it must be greater than 0.80. So the studies that have shown these particular trees have returned values between 0.45 and 0.79. So in general, there are weak support for these kinds of trees which show human beings as distinct lineages. Okay? Even though, again, you see these in everyone's textbooks. Next. So what best fits human genetic variation? Well, geographic distance in miles, genetic distance. Now, you remember the genetic distance that I talked about for subspecies rank? I said it was 20%. That number would be about here, 0.20. This is what we find in anatomically modern humans, 0.03. And you'll note that for all the human populations that have been studied by geographical distance, that sure, if you're in Oslo, Norway, you can look at a Norwegian and say, oh, that's not a sub-Saharan African. But where do you make the break point along the way? if you walk from Nigeria to Norway. So human genetic variation is a continuum which goes by geographic distance. But there's no particular point where you can say, I can draw a line and say, these people are Africans, these people are Europeans, these people are Asians. Those things would be entirely arbitrary. So, now, let's talk about the things that everybody observes. Physical appearance. Well, we can't draw trees by physical appearance either. We've known that from the mid-70s. Ashley Montague's book, Mankind's Most Dangerous Myth, points that out. So, if we try to do so, we get trees of relatedness that don't match our known history. For example, these are physical features such as skin color, hair type, body proportions, okay? All the things that we use and look at people and say that you're different from each other. Well, if we use those things and put them all together, we come up getting groups that don't match our history. For example, Swedish and French people being more closely related to Eskimos and North American Indians than Japanese and Chinese are. See, these are on different branches. So you should have Japanese and Chinese, Eskimos and North American Indians together. So that's because North American Indians and Eskimos are derived from Northeast Asians. But we don't, using physical features. Or down here, these are Papuans and Australian Aborigines. These are sub-Saharan Africans, those who speak the language Bantu, those Pygmy and Bushmen. These guys come out together, but genetically, this group is over here. People from Australia and New Guinea are actually genetically the furthest from sub-Saharan Africans. And again, the simple reason for that is the migratory history of our species. I'm going to skip through that and go back, show you this map. Okay. Human beings started walking here. They walked into Europe, they walked into Asia, okay? They walked across the land bridge, either landing in South America by sea and walking north, or coming this way. Most people don't think that humans came this way, simply because the ice sheets would have made this trip impossible. The modern thinking suggests that people from here came by sea and landed somewhere in South America and then walked north. However, the last place anatomically modern humans end up is in Australia. And if that's the last place, that's going to mean the genetic distance between sub-Saharan Africans and Australoids is going to be greatest. But yet our physical features tie them together. And that makes no sense. And now why does that happen? That happens because skin pigmentation and other physical traits is discordant with phenotypic variation or other physical variation. And the reason for that is that the gradients that affect each character are independent of each other. So for example, if we look at people around the equator, it doesn't surprise anyone that the indigenous people around the equator have dark skin, simply because dark skin helps you resist ultraviolet radiation. Now, as you move northern latitudes, skin gets lighter, and so forth. But you see here are people who we call sub-Saharan Africans with dark skin. These people are Caucasians with dark skin. These people are Asians with dark skin. These people are Australoids with dark skin. All of these groups who are distinct in terms of our evolutionary history show the dark skin phenotype. So if we're using skin color to define race, we get it wrong. Well, what about diseases? After all, everyone knows that diseases like sickle cell anemia are specific to a given race. Well, that's not true either. The sickle cell anemia gene originated in the Middle East and migrated to Western Africa with the caravan routes. And anywhere we find high frequencies of the sickle cell allele, we find high frequencies of malaria transmission. The disease is related to resistance to malaria, not to any so-called racial phenotype. For example, here in Kenya, the highlands of Kenya, frequency is very low. Why? There's no mosquito transmission in the highlands of Kenya. So these people are Kenyans who you would call sub-Saharan Africans, but they don't have sickle cell anemia. Now these people are Yemeni. They have very high frequencies of sickle cell. In fact, in Detroit, where the largest group of Arabs outside of the Middle East live, the physicians treat two general populations for sickle cell: people from Yemen and people who have ancestries from Western Africa. So again, this gene doesn't match supposed racial ancestry. Well, what about disease resistance? Well, to make a long story short, that doesn't match either. And individuals carry genes of diverse geographic origins. This gentleman is Thomas Jefferson. Most of you recognize him. What you don't know is that John Wales, who for the sake of my discussion I will call 4/4 European, meaning his genetic complement is.
If you appreciate the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix and would like to see more, then subscribe to our channel and check us out on Patreon. Links are in the description.